Good morning and welcome to another episode of Unscripted and Unchained RPG Review. I am DM Bluddworth, and as you can see by the graphics, today's video is a response to Shonner over at Shonner Films. Sometimes his channel goes by, Roll for Sanity, and today I'm looking at his own contribution to the betterment of the RPG hobby, and that is how to role play the hard way. So you can find this on DriveThruRPG for free just by going through my link, my affiliate link, and then you just look up Shonner Press and it will come up. So one of the things that Shonner really does push is to role play and to actually engage in role playing, and so he's come out with this booklet, pamphlet, whatever you want to call it, that describes, in his opinion and experience, what role play is actually supposed to look like. And then in some of his videos, he's actually come out and said that Dungeons and Dragons is not a game system that you can role play. And he particularly brings up just the genre of it, of the adventure RPGs are, you're not able to role play them because they're very rules heavy and character class based and so on. So I'm going to actually push back a little bit on that, and just point out where I think that it is possible to do it with certain editions of Dungeons and Dragons. And so, without further ado, let's jump right into how to roleplay the hard way. So here I have it. It's a 43-page document, all written by Sean Driscoll. And let's get into the components. Now, I'm obviously not going to go over this document word for word, but I have highlighted certain sections, and those are the ones that I'm going to focus on. And so I'm going to skip over his preface about how, it was, not originally his intention of writing this, but let's get to who this book is for. People that are roleplay curious. Maybe they are tired of the more gamey feel that rolling dice presents. Some role-playing a character genuinely sounds a lot more interesting to try and learn more about. Existing players who want to advance their role-playing level, or even vet the right players for their next game session, will find the hard way is much more rewarding. So it basically comes out and says that if you are curious of, really engaging in role playing, the activity of role playing your characters, then this is who this book is for. Who this book is not for, and I'm going to disagree with him a little bit here. I should have put the red highlight here. People who have played first generation tabletop adventure games for years or decades will have developed habits and compatible with role playing a character. This book will only be an enigma to them. Well, as somebody who probably fits into that mold of spending a majority of my time playing those first generation adventure tabletop games, I still know what the art of role playing is, and how it is to talk in character and um, try to make the mechanics work to fit that model. But I will continue going through this here, and I'll touch on those points as we go along. So the materials needed: a second gen role playing game that is skill based. Again, I somewhat disagree. You can do it with an older edition of D&D where there are fewer skills or fewer spells and fewer features and such, and you could really boil it down to, very similar to a skill based, even though it might be class based system, because there are skills within a class based system. It's just when you get to the more modern, multi layered, that I think that his objection to it, or his theory that it is counter to role playing, somewhat holds true. So ensure it is a second generation skill based and uses a task difficulty level as a target number for the role. And I absolutely agree with that. That it does further enhance role playing opportunities if the role play doesn't have to stop to do the mechanical outcomes of the actions that they took. All right. And so I do agree with him there. I just think that you can simplify and streamline older editions of Dungeons and Dragons much easier than you can with, like, say, fifth edition or fourth edition, and you can make this work for them. So I'll continue. The practice. 30 minutes of role playing the hard way is a good chunk of time for players to practice the characters in scenes. All right. And again, if they can retain it in 30 minutes, and just, especially if they're trying to break out of old habits, I will give them that, for some of us that have been doing it for that particular way for a long time, decades even, but you can teach old dogs new tricks. All right. So I will throw that out there, that, some of us are capable of making that, crossing that bridge. So anyway, we will continue. I'm going to skip over the terms. So his social contract, and I chopped off the first part because that's all common sense, and I just wanted to focus on this. So no out of character speaking during the gameplay session. Absolutely, I agree with that. It's harder for us that have been doing this for a long time to get into that, but definitely agree. It's a much better experience. Players don't ask the GM questions. Again, agree with that. Each player, including the GM, narrates what the character is doing. The GM states when die rolls are required. The player narrates their success while the GM narrates the PC's failures. And I will get into that a little bit more in detail, but absolutely agree. All talking, as well as asking questions, is done in character. PC speaks to other PCs, NPC speaks to PCs to relay or answer questions. Yeah, so there's no direct, hey DM, can I try this? No, you're much more affirmative in what you're saying, or your character is saying or doing. So you don't ask if they can try something. You tell the GM, this is what my character is doing right now. This is where my character is. This is what my character is trying to do. And, excuse me. And then the GM will say whether a role is required to begin with, and then the GM will hint at potential difficulties. Then the player rolls, difficulty levels, I should say, and I'll go much more into detail with that later. The player rolls, and then the player and the GM will be able to see that roll, and they will both know, or they both should know, whether or not that was a success or failure. If it was a success, the player knows it. The player then describes what their success looks like. If it was a failure, then the GM will narrate what the PC's failure looked like and what its consequences were. All right. No initiative. All right. And This makes sense, and especially when he gets into detail on that. So I will wait until then. No combat rounds is also something that makes sense when you see the narrative scene that is created during the I should say the cinematic scene of how the action moves, and you'll see that when we get to the reading through that section. Characters are allowed to move at the speed of their player's narration, and that's kind of like, it's kind of a strange way of saying it. At the speed of narration, what does that actually mean? In other words, I think it means like if there's hesitancy in what the player is talking about their character's movement, that they're not currently at that moment moving. And he does get to that a little bit later. I'm just a little bit confused by that sentence. So I might need some further comment on that particular one. No narration means no action taken by that player character. That player's character, I should say. They are sitting or standing. They're just there. If they're not saying what they're doing, then they're doing nothing. Now, the GM can move on to, or another player, more preferably, should actually step up and say, well, this is what my character is doing. And then that character didn't necessarily lose an action, or a try during that particular scene, but it'll just come back around to them, and then they'll say, all right, well, this is what I'm doing now, and that kind of thing. So, I skip over this next one. When a character dies, the player leaves the hangout and game until they have created a new character to return to the game. I think that in this style of play, which is a very role play focused style of play, that every single player should have their character and then a backup. And that backup should have been, not an afterthought, but that backup should have been like a character that they're thinking about as they're playing, throughout the days, the weeks, the months, or whatever. How am I going to integrate this character into this particular story should my character now die? So that's why I didn't highlight that particular one, because I don't like to waste people's time at the table, especially if they're coming in person, and to have them, all right, will you go sit over there and roll up a new character, and then think about that character and how that character is going to come back into that, sidelines that player for quite a bit of time. And I think it's better for that player to already have a character in mind and be ready to roll right in, with maybe just a brief break in order to integrate that player back into the actual gaming session. Players must have their character sheets with them always. Yes, and I absolutely agree, and preferably two character sheets. All right, so we will now move on. And I'm going to skip over some of this. I don't want to get into the difference between like setting an established model, which means like a pre-built world, or a sandbox model. I think that the hybrid is technically the best that you can possibly use. So established technically established settings can be sandbox, and this is absolute, they should be sandboxed. You have an established setting, and that's merely the framework. Even though the world is mapped out and its characters are fleshed out, it does not mean that characters are pigeonholed or used as cogs on gears. Players still have free will with their characters. Every town is a sandbox. Every building, every dungeon, every railroad car is still a sandbox. So all of that can be affected by the player's interaction through their characters with the world. So I think it should be a combination of both. I'm not going to get into setting and genre and everything, because that's, it is what it's going to be, and you can role play the hard way in any of these. So I don't see spending any time talking about that. Same thing with setting the tone and comfort zones and setting the theme and such, and the style of play. I want to get more into, or I should say, not the style of play, but the feel of the play. um, I want to get more into the style of play and getting into actually talking about role playing. So the systems, and I'm just going to focus on what second gen role playing games. So more specifically, what he talks about them. So second gen role playing games allow for role playing. They do not interfere with the player's role play. Having unified rules for actions called skills and bell curved results from their dive mechanics creates a perfect environment for role playing. Uh, Bell curves are a necessity as their distribution are not totally random. Purely random die rolls only invites chaos and is of no use for role playing. So yeah, his belief is that the having multiple layers of mechanics interferes with role playing, and I agree with that. It certainly breaks the flow of role playing if you have to stop and look at a chart to see, well, did I hit, or was that a saving throw, or was I able to pick that lock, and so on. If you have to look at charts and graphs in order to figure those things out, you basically stop the whole flow of the role play that was taking place in order to handle the game mechanics. So simplified game mechanics as by having target numbers that are a known number to everyone sitting at the table, then it becomes much smoother, much quicker, more efficient. And I think that's the key word here. It's not so much, oh, this is a class-based first generation game versus a skill-based second generation game. I don't think that that's effectively the problem between the two. It's how the mechanics are resolved, how efficiently they're resolved becomes the real issue. And so when you're dealing with target numbers and difficulty settings and those kinds of things, it actually becomes a much smoother system to where the players are not running their characters off a character sheet with a whole bunch of different possibilities, and then they have to look at their a chart to see if they were effective, whether they hit or whether they made a saving throw, or whether or not they were successful in their skill check. Instead, they roll the die once, or maybe they roll the die and their damage die all at the same time, and they look at the result and they immediately know, was I successful or not? And then they just go into narrating their success, or the GM will step in and narrate their failure. So I agree with him, but I think for a slightly different reason than um, what he's laying out there. It's not simply the fact that, character class based and level based systems aren't open to role play. It's that their mechanics make it more difficult to role play, because they become more time consuming. So anyway, let me move on. So chapter 4. So this is the key chapter for his book. All right. So role play. So character driven characters. All right. And that's a huge difference, right? In what many people might be thinking about when they think about, oh no, it's player driven characters. No, he talks about character driven characters. So you have to separate yourself as the player from what your character is doing. And this is something that I do in my game as well when it comes to character knowledge versus player knowledge. Like, I don't allow the characters to always access the same knowledge that their players may have. And I might actually stop a player and say, well, no, your character wouldn't know that. All right. In this situation, this is what your character knows. or has observed. And that's only based on what that character has experienced already. But, I don't allow players to bring all their knowledge to the table, and especially not have their characters reflect that knowledge. Only what their characters have actually experienced are they able to do that. So, I think even without following this kind of rule, um, some of us have already kind of been doing this, and others, probably a majority don't. So I agree with him there. So character-driven characters is a really important distinction to put out there. Players should always think about what their characters will try next, asking themselves what their characters would try in a situation, what would make sense for their character to try. Is this something their character would try? Also, the way the characters interact with each other is all based on character driven behaviors. All kinds of situations can come from characters simply being around each other. So, again, divorcing the character from the player and starting to think everybody collectively at the table thinking about the characters that they're interacting with through their character, and they might have a very different um, a different synergy character to character than there is player to player, and so that's something that's, I think, important to create that immersion, which he doesn't mention in this document, is the how role playing actually enhances immersion. It actually puts the players into that scene much more deeply when you have that immersion. All right, so character motives and goals. Characters should always have goals, and I'm going to break this down a little bit further. Um, if I'm playing this this way of playing. So if I'm role playing the hard way and I have my character enter a room, my goals are going to immediately interact with the scene I just entered into. All right, that's how my character is going to function. My character is going to enter this room, immediately take an assessment of what this room is presenting my character with, based on the GM's description of that room, and my goal is going to be completing some scene specific task in that very moment. All right, and so having a character goal isn't the broad goal of an adventurer's goal, and what he or she is looking to accomplish throughout their entire career. I think that this really boils down to having a goal as soon as they know the situation that they're in. All right, and then just moving on to that goal. And he does break this down with, goals can be very simple and mundane types of things, like getting out of bed, checking the horse's shoes, making some toast, and so on and so forth. So yeah, there are mundane goals. Not all goals are challenging. Many are trivial, but they are still goals. All right, and you're not going to have to make a roll to get out of bed. All right. He not only says that you're going to check when when a try is something that's interesting, could lead to something interesting, or if it's something, and he doesn't mention this, if it's something that can be challenging. If there's a chance of it actually failing, then the player should roll. All right. So not all goals are challenging. Many are trivial, but are still goals. Narration. This is the most important part of role playing. Players in the game, and I highlighted the entire section because it is completely important. Players in these game sessions are there for the role play. They want to role play. They're invested in their characters. They can't wait to role play them with each other's characters. The players, including the runner, which he calls a GM, so the GM is the runner, the person running the game, narrates what their characters are trying. What a character is tries is simply what their character would try. Nothing is tried out of character. All right. Keep in mind that the characters are character driven. Some characters will be smooth around each other while others may be coarse. Characters will try things or say dialogue through role play by the players. The players simply narrate what their characters try or say in a scene. A couple of sentences are all that is needed for each player to narrate what their character tries. Players must remember that their character should be able to try things in the amount of time it takes them to narrate. Narration violations are discussed later in this book. Cinematics. Action. Roleplay sessions should be narrated in cinematic mode. This helps all the players visualize the scene. The runner describes the area surrounding the characters, keeping the scope tight and telling only what is in line of sight of the characters. I would also mention the other senses, what they can hear and what they can smell, what they can feel, room temperature, those kinds of things. If it's a room, the walls and windows are mentioned. Of course, furniture gets a mention if there is any. Rooms can be escape rooms, futuristic time slip cabins, chip integrated digitized dreamscapes, or just a simple bedroom from the Baroque era with a vaulted ceiling with engraved carvings of golden cupids on it. Cinematic mode also means that the scenes are handled quickly. How long do bar fight scenes last? This is how long such a scene should last in your game, both in game time and real time. Wow, that is a huge thing that requires very efficient dice mechanics. And that I think is where he's going with the idea that older generation games, particularly those that require to hit charts or to make these very difficult calculations on whether or not the player was successful in having their character make an attack or so forth. um, yeah, so very very complex systems are harder to do this in a cinematic feel. It's got to be a much more smoother die roll mechanics. You should get your players in the practice of rolling both their to hit and damage die at the same time. That way you don't, all right, you hit, now you have to go and roll damage. Have them roll both at the same time. It saves a remarkable amount of time, believe it or not, especially if you're going to be in a prolonged combat. But what he's saying here is that you really shouldn't have prolonged combats. Your combats should be very cinematic, a few minutes at the most, and because that's how long they would take if you were watching it in a movie. And so that's how long they would take if you were in real time combat. Try to, if you've ever been in a fight, try to think about how quickly that went. It's really bizarre how fast they a fight actually takes. um and you have all kinds of mental time compression and everything to it. Like everything happens in slow mo. Everything happens in, it's like in your mind, it's taking much longer, but in reality, fights are fast, and it's amazing how quickly they start and end, and so that's what he's talking about here, is that it should be very quick, and that requires potentially altering some rules to make it much more streamlined. And that's why I'm saying, You don't necessarily need a skill-based class list system in order to do that. But you do need to modify the mechanics of especially combat resolution in older games in order to be able to pull this off. All right. So again, we go to the next part here, minimalistic role play. Trying just the bare minimum. Minimalist roleplay is the bare bones roleplay. Player simply says where their character is and what their character tries. Determining a character's motive or goal is the first step in deciding what a character tries or does not try. And so that's why I'm saying when he's using goal, he's using goal the way that I described it earlier, the goal for that particular scene. So you're not talking about your overall character goals, and your goal is going to be hugely affected by what the description of that scene is. A lack of role playing never means that out of character talking is allowed. Okay, so yeah, just because the player isn't active in that moment doesn't mean that they can just start talking outside of character and such. Players can even say what their characters think if this is agreed upon in the social contract. I put this one in red highlight because I really wanted to ask Shonner directly. Um, how is this not giving information to the other players that they wouldn't, their characters would not have? So yeah, if I'm telling the GM what my character is thinking, then everybody else at the table knows that too, and their characters wouldn't know that what my character is thinking. Um, Not unless the player was having the character talk out loud what he or she is thinking, like verbally saying their inner monologue outside, you know, hearable by all of the characters in the group. So I just don't know how you work that out. So if you can explain that a little bit more in detail, I'd appreciate it because I'm confused. All right. So talking in character, just talk. My character is a light sleeper and thinks he heard something. He opens his eyes slowly and begins to get up from bed. All right. The above could clearly have been easily been stated as Asham is a light sleeper and thinks he's heard something. He opens his eyes slowly and begins to get up from the bed. All right. So you see how I took from my character to just Asham and changed it a little bit to make it a little bit more immersive, I think. Even saying, I am a light sleeper, and I think I've heard something, I open my eyes slowly and begin to get up from the bed will work. So you can see the three differences here. One, the player is talking about his or her character, all right, as my character. And the other, talking as the character, or referring to the character by name, which I think is a next step. And then the final one, I am, now you're talking completely in character. Um, and so I think that those different nuances are important for ultimately getting the players used to this process. A player can use either first or third person when saying their character is and what their character is trying, where their character is and what their character is trying. First person, he gives examples. Third person gives examples. Talking in tries. So, so everyone is talking at the same time, kind of. All right. So tries. Each player gets a try at doing something with their character. All right. So Captain, I made it to the engine room. I think I can get the power restored if I bypass the regulator with a jumper. That's the character saying where he is and what he's going to try. Okay. Very short, very specific. Boom. Here I am. This is what I'm going to try. The GM now is listening to this and thinking about, well, what skill is going to be required and how difficult is that bypass going to be? Where everything is. The runner typically narrates the scene. It's something short and sweet and pertains to the scene a character finds themselves. A runner only describes the immediate area in view of the character. And as I mentioned earlier, what does the room look like? What is in it? What does it smell like? What does it feel like? What can they hear in that room? Hit all of the senses, give them a full description of the important details of the room. Um, don't tell them there's a small crack in the wall if that crack has nothing to do with anything. All right. But do describe the room. So you're near the laundry room of a house. You see clothes in a hamper next to the dryer and a box of detergent on the top of the closed lid of the washer. All right. Nothing's mentioned about anything outside of this room other than that. And then the character is going to describe where they're in that room and what they do, what they try, where the character is. The player narrates where their character is in the scene. I step into the laundry room area and look around. You see a door at the other side, says the runner. What a character is trying. The player narrates what their character tries in the scene. I walk over to the washer. I move the detergent and open the washer lid. A scrap of paper falls to the floor next to your feet, says the runner. I pick it up, says the player. It's a note that's lost some of its stickiness on the back. There's writing that says, I miss her so much, still, you know. I go to the other door and turn the knob to enter the room. You enter into a darkened garage. It's too dark to see anything. The door slams shut behind you. The idling engine of the car is heard, and you choke in the exhaust filled room. All right, so here you have just narration of what is going on. It's like the scene of a television show, all right, or a movie. And both are just going back and forth. This is where the player is, the character, I'm sorry. This is where the character is. This is what the character is trying. The narrator gives the runner gives the description of what the character sees. Character sees it, interacts with it. Narrator, runner describes what that resulted in. The character then goes through the next try, moves, changes their location, explains it, and now you have that completed whole scene. Role playing with other characters. Each player says where their character is during the try. That way, each player can see in their mind where all the other characters are in relation to their character. Each player will know how far away the other characters are. If the character can see them and if they can hear them. The reason for doing this is to establish a 3D space where each character is located in the scene. Now, in many cases, and I know Shonner doesn't talk about this very much, I have a feeling he's doing much of this with Theater of the Mind, and he's not using visuals such as maps and or figures, miniatures or anything along those lines. So he's doing this strictly Theater of the Mind, and so the players aren't utilizing a visual like a virtual tabletop, let's say, to do that. So everything has to be described, and they have to describe where their characters are at in a particular room, and then where are they in relation to one another. And so that requires everybody to kind of pay attention to uh, what each player is describing for their character, so that they kind of know where their position is in relation to everybody else's as well. So this does require um, very good skills of paying attention to what's going on. And you can't be kind of zoning out in your chair as the other players are doing things and kind of disconnected from what's going on. You have to be very, very focused. And I think that's why at the very end he gets into, how difficult this is for some people, and I made sure to address that directly. So the hard part, asking questions. So many questions. Since players cannot ask the runner if their character can try something because that would be talking out of character, players ask how difficult something might be in character. Or they can ask other characters. So the runner will have a character that knows or can hint at how difficult something will be to try. There can always be clues that reveal a try's hidden difficulty. All right. And the reason why the player wants to know the difficulty is so that they know when they roll the die, um, they will know whether or not they were successful. And because it's important for them to know that when they roll, so that they can then immediately narrate what happens if they were successful. And the GM can then immediately narrate what the um, what the outcome was, like what it actually did, or if it was a failure, then the runner can immediately describe the consequences of failure. And so, knowing what the difficulty level is important, so that they know the target number and they don't have to ask the mechanic questions of what do I need to roll, or I rolled a 16. Does that hit? They should already know or not know just based on the hints of the information they're getting. And I will relate this to Dungeons and Dragons, where you can do this in a very simplistic way. Um, so you're not using the two hit charts; you're using a target number, base target number, and the player needs to know you have a very simple number of armor classes that they potentially have to, that they'll potentially encounter. And those armor classes are going to have, you also have to use an ascending armor class system, which does not really exist in OD&D, but it's very easy to translate it to it. And so once you know the ascending armor class, you know the target number that you need. You know your modifiers that you need, that you apply to your roll when you're making the roll. And so all you have to, as a player, know is that chainmail armor gives an AC of 5, and or a modifier of 5, and then a shield gives it an additional modifier, and you kind of know, there's a large shield, medium shield, small shield, and what that would do. And then that way, when you're rolling, then you will know what is a success as soon as you've rolled it. And the runner will know immediately if it was a failure. All right, you're not referring to any chart. And so that, I think, is where he's going at, where it's only with hidden difficulties. That should be a known difficulty or a preset difficulty. The person's wearing armor, that's the preset difficulty in hitting them. And so um, there has to be some foreknowledge of knowing what those armor classes actually are and how they affect your target number. Just through a simple role playing can difficulties be learned? Yes, there can be role playing things. So if you're shooting at if you're shooting at an orc that is partially standing behind a pillar. Well, now you know that your shot is going to be a little bit more difficult than if he was completely out in the open. All right. And you might even know that your shot is going to be, um, you're going to need a +2 higher than normal in order to hit him, right? So if you only needed a 14 to hit him, now you know that you need a 16 to hit him. All right. And then you're going to make your d20 roll along with your damage at the same time, just in case you do hit him. And then your damage roll is already done. If you missed him anyway, you're going to know it right away. But then the runner will explain what that miss looked like. If you hit him, then you're going to explain without mentioning numbers. The runner sees the die roll. All right. So runner already knows what the damage is. All right. And you're just to explain that you hit him and potentially how interesting, how do you want to narrate that actual hit. All right. And so that gets me back to um, this can't be completely theater of the mind. And again, Shonner, you can address that hopefully that in the event that die rolls are not visible to everybody, at the time, and I know you say if you can't trust your players, then you can't have them at the table, or you shouldn't have them at the table. But um, how do you avoid them having to say the number? And then once again, now you're getting into talking out of character because you're saying, "Oh, I did 6 points of damage." That's to me out of character, rather than my arrow hit with you know the maximum damage that it could, or even better, it hits solidly. And then you'll have a general impression. Now, you don't have to go into the number of it if the GM sees the number. Um, so that's just a little question of mine. How do you deal with that and eliminating that mechanical talk from the action taking place? So let's go with the player says, Par walks into the junkyard. She can feel the heat of this planet's sun cooking the roasting metal air cars as she tries to squeeze between them without singeing herself. The runner says, behind you, the sound of dirt filled boots scrape towards you. Then nothing. Then the sound of a cig lighter, then boots. Parr turns slowly around and looks. The man stops in his tracks about 8 feet from you. The typical barbarian of this world. At least this one is not bald for a change. Parr puts her hand to her hip slug pistol and tells him, I'll shoot you dead if I don't like your answer. I'm looking for my car, or at least parts that are left of it. The runner interrupts. Are you Baroness Parley, whatever, long name of Orim? That's not an answer. You didn't ask the question yet. The player says, how do you know my name? And that horribly long title of mine, for that matter. If I answer, you'll most likely shoot me. If I don't answer, Miss Parr. The player says Parr grabs her gun and extends her arm all the way forward, elbow locked, aiming for his head. The runner says, don't make this difficult for yourself. Parr shoots. See how the runner revealed the difficulty level of the player's shot. All right, so just by listening to the narration, you kind of get a sense of whether or not taking the shot is going to be a difficult shot. Very similar to how I described it earlier with the orc behind a pillar, and you kind of know that's going to give the orc a certain amount of cover, and so it's going to make the difficulty a little bit higher. And and the player might already be aware of what that kind of cover, partial cover, actually grants, and they'll know to modify their roll based on that to begin with, or it'll modify their target, I should say. Tries. Skills are essentially when role playing that what a character is trying or whether they are successful. A skill check is needed when the character tries to do something interesting. And I would add to this, or has a chance of failure. All right. Maybe he includes that as being what's called interesting. Let's say a character tries to access the memories from a systematic brain found on the table workbench. The character also learned from a journal that the procedure is formidable. So the difficulty level is formidable for such a try. And then they go through the whole process of making that attempt. But here is one way that you can narratively tell what the difficulty level is going to be. All right, they know it's going to be formidable because they read in a journal that trying to attempt this is formidable. Hidden difficulties. The difficulty level isn't mentioned during the role play between characters. So, yeah, there are going to be certain circumstances where the difficulty is hidden. The player just makes their roll under the assumption that they're going to be successful. The runner is going to know whether or not that was successful. And here's a question for you, Shonner, is that so the player rolls, the player believes that that he was successful, and he starts narrating. I would, if I know that he actually failed, I would step in and say, as the runner, I would say, yeah, as you're, let's say he was picking a lock, as you're turning the lock picks into the lock, and you hear those first couple of tumblers go, but much to your chagrin, the lockpick slips and misses that last tumbler, and you do not unlock the door. So there the player thought that the character was successful, and yet it turned out, because the difficulty of the lock, which was a hidden difficulty, that they actually were not. And so you don't really mention that, like, how do you step in and inform them that what they thought was a success was not, when you have a hidden difficulty. Role playing would often decide. Dice are not used in the place of role play. However, dice do have their uses, but only when difficulty levels are mentioned during roleplay between characters. Difficulties will still be there if not revealed through roleplay, as in the case of hidden difficulties. Yeah, so we already knew that. Narration violations. So illegal tries. Violations are when a character fast travels their character, such as my character buys her ticket, takes the rocket trip to Mars, and unpacks her luggage after arriving in her hotel and at the Prontolinius Marsport. All right. Yeah, fast travel, because anything can happen along that way. Even though buying her ticket shouldn't be something that she could fail at. Um, Taking the rocket trip to Mars, there can be all kinds of things that occur during that time frame. And so teleporting or fast traveling characters from one point to another is something that you need to avoid. And so that would be an illegal narration violation. Shortcuts. Shortcuts are when a player glosses over what their character is trying. He kills all the enemies in the that are near him. All right, so obviously that's just waving away, um, the entire scene basically, as far as all kinds of things could have happened, but they're just waving it away. And I'm going to argue that the GM can do this more often than players do. I've seen plenty of GMs that just wave a lot of these things away, just trying to move their concept of the story forward. I mean, I've seen this, done to ridiculous levels in some cases where it's like, wait, well, how did they get there? I've seen both actually. I've seen fast travel being done by GMs, and I've seen shortcuts being done by GMs. I've seen that quite a number of times actually, where you're sitting there and saying, "But wait, what? How did that happen?" And even the players sitting at the table are like, "Wait, what? How did I get here? I thought I was still here, and now I'm all of a sudden here." So I have seen this, and I know Shonner has actually shown it on his channel as well. No initiative. No initiative roll or check is made with the hard role playing style to see who gets to try first. Basically, what he says is whoever says what they're doing first acts first. It doesn't matter, like D&D and other older rule systems, and even to this day, they still have an order of sequence that's based on what action type you're doing. So it basically goes missile, magic, melee. Um, Movement sometimes can be done at the beginning, like half movement at the beginning and then final movement at the end. Full movement is the full action then. So, but you can do a movement and an action and so on. But they usually put them in that kind of a sequence. Initiative is also something that talks about, well, which side goes first. And what he's saying here is that the referee basically, or the GM, or the runner, decides what makes most sense for which side to go first. And then you just go through that party's tries as they're going through it. So if a player doesn't say what their character is, where their character is, simply means that they haven't left their last location. If a player doesn't say what their character is trying, it merely means that they aren't trying anything. All right, so usually when a player doesn't say anything, another player gets a try. An available character whose player speaks first receives the so-called initiative. That character gets a try. So, yeah, whoever speaks first, that's who's moving first. That's who's getting to say what they are trying first, and then everybody else will chime in as they go. And yes, it can all happen simultaneously. When we go to no combat rounds, that's where I was kind of making that point about who acts first in the combat sequence. And with no combat rounds, it kind of becomes a little bit more of an organized chaos, but it still makes sense as long as everybody knows where the characters are, and the characters are clearly stating what they're trying, and then it can all happen simultaneously. It doesn't have to be a turn-based system like we often think about it. Combat skills are just like any other skills a character has and should be tried as all skills are tried. So basically what he's talking about is target numbers and that kind of a thing. Very, very simple resolution of to hit and damage. And if you've eliminated the to hit charts and everything, it does become a vastly streamlined system of doing so. And you don't base it on what kind of weapon or spell the character is casting or using. You base it solely on who said they're acting first. So let me give you an example. So I have three characters in my party. All right, I have character A is a magic user. Character B is a ranger with a bow, and character C is a fighter with a sword. Well, as soon as they walked into the situation and the situation was described to them, the room was described to them, and the first one to speak up happened to be the fighter with the sword. And the fighter with the sword said, "I'm going to move 5 feet to my left and try to hit the orc standing there with the bow." All right. If he said that before the magic user said what spell he or she was going to look to cast, or the ranger said which target he is going to shoot his bow at, the fighter goes first. It doesn't matter that he's melee weapon. He was the first to say it. He was the first to move. You can assume cinematically that the magic user was taking a little bit more time to cast it, get his spell ready to cast, and the ranger was actually scanning the room looking to select a good target to shoot at. So the fighter's action was much more decisive. Knew exactly what he was doing, when he was doing it, and just went and tried. Um, and he chose a target that was closest to him, and so all of that just happens first. So and all of that happens simultaneously. And then the opposing side, let's assume that through the narration or just through the situation that it was that they're not going to be able to respond until maybe after the fighter's action was, because he did move so much faster. But it makes more sense for one of them, because they have bows at the ready, are able to shoot first. All right. And they will get their action before maybe even the magic user is able to cast off his spell. So it's all taking place at the same time, all supposed to take place very, very quickly. Remember the bar fight analogy of bar fights they don't take that long to happen, and this shouldn't take that long to happen either. And that requires a very, very quick decision making by the players for their characters, and just an efficient way of um, rolling their attacks just like any other skill, knowing whether it was successful or not because they're using target numbers and not charts, and pre-rolling their damage die, so in case they did hit, they know exactly how much they've hit by. And um, the referee, GM, or runner is seeing everything in real time as it happens, and then just spinning that tale of what's going on. What any failures look like, what how the scene is changing based on what the character actions are. So the ending, all right. So this is getting back into the aftermath of running this. So jolt back to reality. Players who choose may have died off during an intense session I'm sorry. Players whose characters may have died off during an intensive game session will be relieved when they see that they themselves are still very much alive. All right, so no one is getting harmed by any of this. A 4-hour role play session can be mentally draining. And that's what I kind of mentioned earlier as well, that he was going to point out to, was that yes, trying to break out of that uh, player controlled character instead of character controlled character is mentally draining, because you're constantly having to think and act as the character and not as the player playing the character, and it's different. But I don't think it's an insurmountable thing for an old dog to learn these new tricks. Questions happen after the session, right? So what just happened at the end of the role play session is when players can ask their questions. Runners ask the players what they thought of the session. Questions about rules and rulings and are asked at that time, if there are any at all. If the system is very, very simple, there's very few rules that you actually have to question. I mean, there's nothing to question about target numbers and that kind of thing. And if all skills are based on a very simple system of target number, then there's no real questions to be asked about rules. Um, so I think when he says that, the difference between first generation and second generation, he could also ask the question of, well, is it a rules light system as opposed to a very rules heavy system? Are characters multi-layered with very complicated action mechanics, or are they simple, like OD&D? Very, very simple character mechanics. The only difficulty comes when you deal with the two hit charts, and even in basic D&D, the two hit charts are really boiled down to very, very simple things to see. Anyway, so I think that. But those questions, questions of rules, come only when you have a more complex rule system that you're using, and that could be first or second gen. Story. The downtime after the game session is when the players begin to replay the things that just happened in their heads, all of it, saying to each other about the one part or the other scene where such has happened, and so on, to decide to remain behind, or so on and so forth. I'm sorry, I'm just having a little trouble reading through the whole thing. Um, yeah, basically, players love to talk about the parts that were the best and the parts that they totally weren't expecting. All right, the takeaway. The created story is the one of the rewards of role playing the hard way. If recorded, it will sound like an audiobook that can be played back and enjoyed by the others. So basically, when you're hearing it as like a story being told. All the characters are talking as characters. Um, the GM is only explaining what the characters see at the time, and there is virtually no talk about game mechanics. And the only way that you could have no talk about game mechanics is if the game mechanics are simple enough in their resolution, and everyone can see those die rolls and know what those die rolls mean. And that always brings me back to that one question for you, Shonner, is that this cannot completely take place in theater of the mind if you need to see their rolls, and know what their damage rolls are, for instance, because how are they going to explain that to you? I'm not sure how that takes place. So, and that's pretty much it in there, Shonner. All right, so getting back to this, and I know this was, took some time to get through because I wanted to get through the whole thing and give you the general gist of it, but also to, point out some questions that I have for it. Um, this is definitely something. Listen, it's free, so go to Drive Through RPG, do a search, Shonner Press. This will come up. Download it, give it a read through, see how you can, take a look at it, and see how you can implement certain aspects of it. And I think that many of these points are really good points. It will make you it will make you try to function, as a game master or as a player role playing a game a little bit differently, and I think a little bit closer towards, actually role playing your characters. It'll certainly put you into a different mindset. For Shonner, the only things that I kind of missed from it is mention of immersion and how role playing enhances immersion, or how immersion might actually enhance role playing as well. And also, how do you deal with actually seeing how you deal with actually seeing the die mechanics as they are rolled, and everybody kind of knowing what those are, so that they can know immediately, well, this is how I'm going to narrate what occurred here, without using those numbers and referencing those numbers. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and forward to Shonner's response to this video as well. And hopefully he will, I'm sure he will, he'll pick this apart and he'll look at the various points. So I'm asking for clarifications on certain things. And I'm telling you, like D&D, especially the older editions of D&D, where there aren't as many of a focus on those two hit charts, you can definitely role play D&D with just some minor rules tweaks, such as changing armor class to ascending armor class. That gives you a target number rather than using a chart, and you can convert many of those skills, you know, to target numbers as well. So it's a very simple dice resolution system. And I think that's the key to it. You can have classes without that have skills attached to them, rather than just a classless skill based system. So what you call a second generation system. I think it could work with either, as long as the first generation system is simple enough and not multi-layered character, um, character sheet based kind of gameplay. So thanks for everyone dropping in. I hope you liked this video. If you hadn't subscribed, please consider subscribing. I know many of my visitors are not subscribers, so I welcome you to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel grow, which gives it more reach. And if you want to leave your questions or comments in the section, please do so. And as always, enjoy the rest of your week, and I look forward to seeing you on the gaming screen sometime soon. Have a great afternoon.